What did the ancient God of Israel look like? Did he have a body? Did he have hands and legs and feet? Did he get mad? Or is he just some cosmic spirit? We're going to discuss this question with Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou of the University of Exeter in the UK. You are not going to want to miss this conversation. So come on, let's go dig. Hey, welcome back. I'm Dr. Bob Cargill, the excavator, editor of Bible and Archaeology, and I am thrilled to welcome today Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou of the University of Exeter, who is going to be discussing with us today her new book, God and Anatomy. Professor Stavrakopoulou has written essentially an anatomy book that looks at not only the Hebrew deity, but ancient concepts of deities, and we want to talk about that. So, Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I am excited about this book that you have written. I'm glad that you're here to discuss it with us. According to Amazon, it is number one on several of their book charts, including number one new releases. So I want to jump right in and get to talking about it, if that's all right. You say at the beginning of the book, this is the book that you wish you had when you were at university. Why is that? And tell our viewers, why did you write this book?
I wrote it because it's in a way, it's my answer. It's my way of exploring the thing that I've always been interested in, the thing that first motivated me to want to study religion at university anyway. So yeah, I say at the beginning of the book that this is the book I wish I'd read when I was an undergraduate. I went to Oxford University. I did a theology degree. And I did that degree because I was really curious about the religious past. And in particular, I was curious about the Bible and about this guy, Jesus. And I was curious as to why certain forms of ancient religion that we find in the Bible have persisted into the modern world today. And yet other forms of ancient religion, the ones that I was really interested in, the Greek gods and goddesses, Egyptian deities, why had they fallen out of currency, if you like? And yet this ancient God of the Bible had somehow survived into the modern day to become the God of Judaism and Christianity. So that's why I went to university to study theology. And I got there and I was studying the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament Tanakh for the first time. I'd done a bit of New Testament stuff when I was at high school,
right? But
this was my first time with the Hebrew Bible. And it was amazing. It was amazing. There were these incredible myths and traditions and stories. And above all, there was this God who really reminded me of the gods of ancient Greece and the gods that I'd been reading about since I was a kid. And yet no one was talking about the fact that this was a God just like them. Everybody kept telling me that this was a God completely different from these ancient deities. And I was like, he doesn't seem that different to me. And this seems like a very kind of anthropomorphic, vivid, colourful, dynamic, changeable, emotional deity. And no one was talking about it at university. And when I asked some of my lecturers and professors, this seems to be a very male God, a very masculine God, and this is a God who has a body. I was told, no, all of these biblical references and allusions to his body and his body parts are just metaphor or poetry. You're supposed to look through these texts at their theological truths. And I thought that was a bit strange, and it seemed to me like they were censoring this literature. And so, fast forward, and I end up specializing in Hebrew Bible primarily, and being interested in the ancient cultural and social contexts of this ancient deity and his ancient worshippers. And I figured it was about time that I wrote the book that I'd like to have read when I was 18, 19.
Sure. Well, I mean, the book appeals to me because I was a human physiology major as an undergrad. I was a pre-med guy before I switched over to religion. And so a big, thick anatomy book was a staple, right? That's a reference that you had. So the concept of the book is brilliant. But these were the questions that I had as well that caused me to leave science, to cause me to leave, medicine and to go over to religion. I was raised religious, and I kept reading these things about the deity, right? About this deity, and we can set aside for the purpose of this conversation whether or not there really is a deity, right? We have our opinions of this, but for the purpose of this conversation today, we're talking about the concepts of deities in antiquity and the God described in the Bible. That's right. That's what we're having. So I kept reading about this deity in the Bible, and he has body parts, right? He gets angry, and he has emotions, right? And he has hands and feet. And yet I was always told by my more progressive friends, well, no, God is cosmic and he's genderless. And yet I was told by my conservative friends, no, God's a male, and the father is the head of the household. And so there were certain peoples that were using God's maleness to justify the patriarchy. And there were other people who were kind of seeing a cosmic God. How could God have a gender? How could he even have a body? And I was like, well, this is one of those things that in addition to all the contradictions that I find, especially once you learn the Hebrew and the Greek, that caused me to say, I've got to do this for a living. And so I would like to spend a moment talking about this terrestrial vision, this terrestrial description of the God, if that's all right, of the deity. I mean, that was what you are describing, right? That's why talking about the book. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Right? In Genesis 1:27, you have this word tselem, right? That man and male and female, he made them in the image of God. When that same word is used to describe graven images in Numbers 33:52, 1 Samuel 6:5, 2 Kings 11:18, Ezekiel 7:20, and other places in the Bible. So what does it mean to be made in the image of God?
Well, theologians would tell you that it means that you are made in the spiritual likeness or image of God, or that you're made in the moral image of likeness of God, or some other kind of weird abstracts. But it's not. I think it means that humans were made in visual correspondence with God, that they share, that humans are God-shaped and gods are human-shaped. I think that's what that idea is indexing, the idea that there is a visual correspondence between God and this creature he has crafted. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because in that creation narrative in Genesis, we're all like, you and I have done this before, we teach our students, we show our students this very plural language that's used, that the deity uses, let us make man or mankind in our image. And we point out that actually this was an ancient world in which Yahweh was not a solitary deity. Yahweh was not on his own in the heavens. That, Yahweh had these other deities and divine beings in his kind of household. And so even that kind of being made in this kind of, being made in his image, but being made male and female, it does suggest some kind of correspondence to the ways in which across ancient Southwest Asia, people understood their gods to have human-shaped bodies and to have, genders in a very similar way that humans have genders, and to have sexual, genital parts in ways that humans did too. And I think that's what those verses in Genesis are indexing, this much older, but also a much more usual way of understanding what deities were like. But the point is that we couldn't, everybody understood that human beings weren't usually able to encounter or to observe the gods in their natural habitat, in their heavenly habitat. They understood that the gods can manifest themselves in various ways, some of the constellations, for example, but they could also manifest themselves as cult statues. And cult statues were more than just representations of the deities that they looked like. They were understood to be the deity. They were brought into being via cooperation between the god and the ritual specialist, if you like. They were brought into being. And so the cult statue was the deity. And in that sense, I think when we see the same word, Selim, being used of images and of the likeness of human beings to God, it's basically, it's reflecting the notion that this is about a very intimate correspondence of form, of shape, of image, of visual appearance. So that's what I think is going on in those particular texts in Genesis.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also say, I mean, we have evidence of ancient worshipers, not only ancient Israelites, but ancient Canaanites and people in this region coming and actually feeding the deity, right? You have examples of people coming to feeding the dead, but also coming to present offerings to these statues, to these cult statues. And I guess that's just the natural extension of the idea of building a temple itself, right? Why does a cosmic deity with no body need a house, right? Why does he need a temple? And I know what we're told later on, it's a place for worshipers to come and congregate to worship. And I get that with the idea of a synagogue. But early on, temples were houses for the physical presence of the deity, were they not?
Absolutely they were. I mean, these were divine dwelling places, temples in their material form manifested and monumentalized the meeting place between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm. This is where the deity was. A temple is called a house, for good reason. It is a house of the deity. And so absolutely the deity was understood to be present within. And so things like sacrifices, I mean, the biblical texts are really clear about the nature of sacrifices. These aren't just kind of symbolic offerings. The deity in the Hebrew Bible talks about the pleasing fragrance. He can smell the smell of these sacrifices. This is it appeals to him, it entices him in the way that we smell, good food on the barbecue. Right. And we think, wow, that's really tasty. Exactly. And it's a similar kind of thing. It's a very bodily understanding of what these sacrifices were doing. I mean, obviously, the gods were understood to consume their food in ways that humans don't. Right. But nonetheless, they were understood to almost to share meals with their worshippers, which is ultimately why temples were so important, because yes, there were places where the deity dwelt. But as I said, as the meeting place of the heavenly and earthly realms, they were also a social space. This is where worshippers socialized with their deities. I mean, it's very difficult, I always say, to socialize with an abstract idea. How do you do that? Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that, deities are imaginary beings, whether we're talking about Marduk of Babylon, or even if we're talking about, the ghost of Samuel, whatever we're talking about, these divine beings are imaginary beings. But it's very hard to socialize with either an abstract or something that is conjured in the imagination. And so what you do is you find very human ways of socializing. And that means understanding that your deity has a body, that your deity is present in this particular house, in, the temple, that your deity shares meals with you. I mean, so ultimately, temples were these social spaces as well as divine spaces.
Fascinating. And we have examples in antiquity, right, of evidence, not only of statues, of representations of deities. Forget other religions, like of representations of deities in even the Jerusalem temple, right, that were once placed there. And we know this because Hezekiah and Josiah had them thrown out of the temple, right? But we have actual representations of these manifestations of the deities in the temples, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really extraordinary the way in which, I mean, obviously we've got good examples from Egypt and Greece and Mesopotamia of texts that talk about building these statues, crafting these statues, housing these statues, dressing them, adorning them. But the Hebrew Bible itself is really, it admits that there were images in the Jerusalem temple and in other temples, all the other temples that the biblical writers don't like. Right. But there were also images in these temples too. And I think the idea that somehow Israelite religion was always and iconic, so always shunned images. The idea that it was always monotheistic, and so, absolutely abhors the worship of other deities. They are later ideologies from a later period of time that have played a part in the reshaping and recrafting of older traditions. And so I do think we need to kind of take seriously the idea that the biblical editors were perfectly aware that their ancestors were using images of Yahweh and Yahweh's other divine colleagues in their holy places. But one of the most important examples, I guess, of evidence that, we have that deities were understood to be physically located in their temples is obviously the famous temple at Dara, where you have these extraordinary, huge, just over a meter in length, footprints carved into the stonework of the temple floor. So a pair of feet pointing inwards on the threshold, and then the left foot striding in to the center of the temple, and then the right foot reaching in, striding in to the very back, the Holy of Holies in the temple. And these footprints only go one way. They just go inside. They don't come out again. This is about the permanence of the deity. This is the deity returning to the temple or entering the temple and not leaving again. And, as we know, the temple at Dara in Syria, not that about 40 miles from Aleppo, is extraordinary because it's architecturally, in terms of its blueprint, it's very typical of a lot of West Semitic or Levantine temples that we find, including the description of the temple in Jerusalem that supposedly Solomon built. So it really is extraordinary. We've got all sorts of parallels of that kind of imagery of gods being in their temples in texts and iconography from all over ancient Southwest Asia.
That's right. And that's just fascinating. And we talked with Shua Kiselevitz, who's uncovered this new temple at Tel Motza, and she says that blueprint matches the blueprint of Ain Dara and the description in Jerusalem. So you're right. This temple blueprint is not unique to Jerusalem. It's very similar. And of course, they just announced that they've uncovered a niche with probably representations of some kind of icon, some kind of, if it's a person or a deity in there. So this whole notion of no icons in the temple does appear to be late. In fact, I recall the idea of Bel and the Dragon. Now that's a very, very late story where they're trying to prove that the deity doesn't actually eat the food, but that comes at a later date. And I want to talk about in a minute when you think this transformation takes place, when God loses his body, because I think it's safe to say God was imagined as a male, right? As a male figure. But when we talk about for instance, God wrestling with Jacob at the river Jabbok, I mean, that's hard to get around, that God has a physical body, right? I mean, he's physically wrestling with Jacob, and Jacob's basically saying, he's winning. He's essentially, this is where the name Israel comes from, wrestling with God. This is where he changes his name. And I was always shocked basically at the notion that Jacob's actually winning the fight with God. And he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And then he blesses him, and then he gives him the cheap shot, right? He hits him in the thigh, if that's really his thigh, or if he gives him I was a catcher in college as a baseball player, and so I'm familiar with the shots to the thigh.
With the tactic.
With this tactic. But if that's what was going on, or if it was actually his thigh, but regardless of this, that God has to, do this to him. This is a wrestling match with God, is it not? That's pretty physical.
That's the way in which the biblical writers want us to understand this passage. I mean, that's what's so interesting about that particular story, is that scholars have wrestled with it, for generations, and they're trying to work out, it's not a very impressive or theologically appropriate way to depict the deity, if it is this huge kind of God that's in control of everything, and you would think wouldn't need to be physically present to make his mark, or to or to, make his mark on Jacob. So scholars used to say, could this be, I mean, it may well be that this is some kind of recycled myth, some kind of local myth associated with this place. The river itself is a liminal crossing point, which suggests it's kind of, neither one place nor the other. It's quite dangerous.
Right.
We often find particularly sort of demonic ideas associated in the ancient world with similarly sorts of liminal places. The nighttime is an important backdrop to this particular story. So, some scholars said, is this, this is a story about a river god or a demon that's been repurposed by the biblical writers. Yeah, maybe it is. But the fact is that even if it's been repurposed, the biblical writers, the way in which we find this tradition now, are very comfortable in saying that this is Yahweh, that Jacob wrestled with God. Which, is extraordinary. I mean, it's putting Jacob, we know that Jacob's an important ancestor anyway, but it's really elevating his status. He is almost godlike in strength. And in that way, he's very similar to a lot of the other heroes that we find from Mesopotamian myth, from Greek myth. This kind of superhuman strength and charisma and status. So yeah, it's extraordinary that it's in the Hebrew Bible, given the kind of ideological refashioning its texts have undergone. It was clearly an important tradition. It clearly had to stay. And it's clearly, the writers are identifying this very corporeal deity as Yahweh himself.
Yeah, I've always been intrigued by this, that and I talk about this in my Melchizedek book. There are instances that I think, and people have pointed this out, scholars have pointed this out for generations, right? That scribes go in and they try to remedy what became later problematic texts by just fixing the Masoretes, and they would fix these texts. But some of these stories are so central to the story of ancient Israel, right? They're the patriarchs, right? That they couldn't just eliminate the story. Another one of those is the three men going down to talk to Abram, right? Sarah is going to conceive at an advanced age. There's three men coming in. Two of them are going to continue down to go talk to Lot. And one of them is talking about how Sarah is going to conceive a child. And all of a sudden, it's God talking to Abram.
Yeah.
And there's always been this rabbinic debate about whether that man, it very clearly says it's three men. Yeah. And two of them continue on. And then it says the Lord is talking to Abram. I mean, is that God? It's interpreted as an angel, or is anything that they can do to pull that away from being a very anthropomorphic version, manifestation of God?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Esther Hamori, our friend and colleague, wrote a fantastic book about this quite a few years ago. And she describes this as almost the most anthropomorphic image of God in the Hebrew Bible, because this is a God who is not just human shaped, but he seems to be human sized, because Abraham doesn't seem to recognize that there's anything out of the ordinary about this guy. But it's a fantastic story because, you've got this image then of, the two other divine beings, and we can assume that they are divine beings or kind of, again, colleagues of Yahweh. Off they go. And then you're left with Abraham and God walking down the road together. And then the narrator's telling us that God is talking to himself. He's kind of trying to make up his mind, like whether he's going to kind of reveal what he's about to do to Abraham. So it's not just anthropomorphic in terms of the visual and the physical nature of this deity. It's very anthropomorphic in terms of his kind of very human-like way of kind of mulling things over and talking to himself and trying to decide what he's going to do or not. It's an extraordinary story. But as you say, we've got these episodes, particularly, but not exclusively, related to the great ancestors of Israel that were clearly of such value culturally, such a kind of a particular kind of pedigree to these stories in terms of identity, in terms of belonging, in terms of place, in terms of ancestry, that, the biblical editors clearly didn't feel that they had to eradicate them, which suggests that there was still some comfort with the idea of a very anthropomorphic God. When these texts were being redacted, I mean, most scholars would say that a lot of that material in Genesis has undergone some kind of reshaping, probably beginning in 5th century BC perhaps, but we know that these texts remain very fluid right up until the early centuries of the Common Era. And so the fact that, someone hasn't gone through with like a big black Sharpie and just sort of cut this stuff out does suggest that it's too important to delete, if you like, from these sacred scrolls, and B, that actually it's okay that you can have these anthropomorphic views of God. People are much more comfortable with it. And that reflects, I think, the diversity of theological views in the ancient world about, from God's own worshippers, from Yahweh's own worshippers. There were hugely diverse views about the nature of this deity. And we've just been left with a very kind of fossilized, if you like, but ideological view that God had only ever been monotheistic and had never had and didn't have a body.
Right.
But, that's centuries and centuries within Jewish tradition and Christian tradition of enculturation, basically.
Right.
You need to look at these texts in their ancient context.
And I think that's a good point to make, that this description of God with a body and with emotions and, gosh, lacking foresight. I mean, always trying to change his mind, and God, with the story of Noah, regretting that he made humans and wanting to wipe them out and starting over and trying to negotiate with Abram, whether or not he's going to destroy these people. That is coming from people who fully believe in this deity. They're worshipers. They're the strongest supporters of this deity. It's not coming from the outside. It's not coming from critics, right? This is coming from the biggest supporters of the deity.
Exactly. It's the people that are curating these traditions and crafting new ones as well. So even into the rabbinic period, you look at some of those rabbinic texts and they're massively comfortable, a lot of them, with the idea that God has a body. And in some ways, God's body gets even more, becomes even more of a focus of spiritual reflection and sort of moral reflection. And so you have these incredible little glimpses of this deity who is so devastated at the destruction of the Jerusalem temple that he wanders around the site crying and kissing the broken down walls of the temple. Just extraordinary stuff. And you kind of think, if a lot of rabbinic circles were comfortable with this, right up into the middle of the Common Era, then, perhaps we're the ones with the hang-ups about God's body, that this was not as much of a problem in the ancient world as perhaps we might assume. I think that can be said about a lot of modern theological, in modern Christianity, that the ancient worshipers of the Hebrew deity, I think both on the Christian side, but also on the Jewish side, on the Hebrew side, were more comfortable with certain concepts, God being responsible for both good and evil being one of them that quickly comes to mind. But since we've already kind of introduced the topic, let's talk about genitals for a second, right? Because you talk about it in your book, so I'll be the one to bring it up. And I mentioned in my book, The Cities That Built the Bible, the story of Rehoboam when he takes the throne. And, he does kind of this locker room, kind of this frat boy story of, does he want to be tougher than his father Solomon, or does he want to kind of go a little easier and get the people to like him? And he basically, decides to go stronger, be tougher than Solomon, right? And he says, essentially, my little finger, my little one, is thicker than my father's thighs, right? He delivers this very famous line, and I explain in the book that he's making a sexual pun here. He's basically saying, my little finger is thicker than my father's junk, essentially, right? Or something like that. And he uses this word that gets translated as thighs quite a bit. And he's talking about his father there. But you mention in your book that these same words
are often attributed to the Hebrew God as well, to Yahweh, and that the deities, not only throughout Southwestern Asia and Mesopotamia, but in the Bible, God is described as having a sexuality as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the big reasons why in both modern, contemporary Jewish and Christian traditions, there's a real discomfort around even the notion that God could have a body. Is because if God has a body, does it have genitals? And we have huge hang-ups about sex as modern people, but particularly in Western traditions, we have huge hang-ups about sex and the genitals, mostly because of what Christianity has done to ideas about sex and and genitals. But I think, when you're reading lots of biblical texts, I mean, penis bragging, let's call it for what it is, penis bragging, is a very standard motif mythologically, but also sort of socially in these ancient societies across ancient Southwest Asia and Egypt. And penises were absolutely crucial within the divine realm, in the sense that, for example, fertility, we tend to think that goddesses were responsible for fertility. This is a complete misunderstanding. Fertility tended to be a very masculine divine attribute, not a feminine divine attribute. So goddesses, yes, were responsible for things like shaping a fetus in the womb, ensuring its safe delivery, protecting the child once it was born, and looking after issues of lactation and various other things. But fertility itself was more often than not was a masculine divine attribute. And some of the very earliest myths that we have from Mesopotamia celebrate not just these male deities responsible for creation and fertility having penises, but for the enormous size of their penises. I mean, Enki, digs ditches with his. The god in Egypt, the god Min, is always iconographically represented both with an erection, a permanent erection, and with his right hand raised, which, if you translate that into kind of Hebrew speak, it would be his yad is permanently raised, as is his yad between his legs is permanently raised. And so, we find really similar things in the Hebrew Bible, not so much in the sense that this is a God who is often sexually active, although we do have allusions to myths in which he is sexually active. That material, that very upsetting, distressing, horrifying material in Ezekiel 16 and 23, which tells the story of Yahweh essentially grooming a baby girl until she reaches puberty and then having a sexual relationship with her, is one example. We have other mythological examples in Hosea, the way that Yahweh says he's going to seed himself in Jezreel, and this very kind of fecund, fertile imagery. But then we also have two striking visions of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible, one in Isaiah 6 and one in Ezekiel chapter 1, in which we seem to have this sense in which the phallic presence of the God is particularly important. And this is about a God who is he's a creator God, and that's what both of these texts are really playing on, the idea that this is a God who is a creator God, and just as he can create, he can destroy. This is a God who is ultimately the source of all life, which is what a lot of these penis myths around ancient Southwest Asia are indexing. And so in Ezekiel 1, you have this remarkable image of the prophet who was a priest. So, he's got his hang-ups in particular about, everything has a place, everything should be in its place. He's very clear about what can be revealed about the deity and what must be concealed about the deity. But he has this image, he sees one shaped like a human sitting on a throne, and this is an extraordinary throne in which the cherubim that sort of accompany the deity are suddenly kind of brought to life, and this is also, they kind of are incorporated into his chariot, and their wings are beating loud, and it's this whole kind of very ultra hypersensory environment. And he sees the deity, he can see the human shape of the deity, but the top half of the deity's body is covered by this kind of dazzling brightness and fire, as is the bottom half of his body. And the prophet sort of navigates his way as he's saying what he sees. He navigates his way up and down the divine body and sort of saying, oh, everything was concealed, there was fire, there was brightness. But the one part of his body that is revealed to the prophet is motnaim, which is a Hebrew bird that is normally very politely translated as loins,
right?
But refers to the genitals. And so it's in a way, I make the point in the book because I kind of compare the covering of Adam and Eve's genitals in the story in Genesis with this uncovering of the deity's genitals in Ezekiel. And it's almost like, if concealing genitals in Genesis is what makes humans human, then it's almost like the revelation in this particular image in Ezekiel is what of genitals is what makes God God. So yeah, it's an extraordinary text. I mean, and also, let's remember that Ezekiel, primarily because of this kind of material, like in Ezekiel 1, but also these very troubling stories in Ezekiel 16 and 23. Ezekiel was a text that, was banned from being read aloud in certain synagogues. Right. It was in the ancient world, there were some men were only, you're only allowed to study it once you'd reached the age of, 30. So people knew that these were dangerous texts and had to be handled with care because they were so sensational, explosive.
I noticed that the use of apocalyptic language, to not disguise, but to kind of work around just explicit references to the genitals, things like that. That was a common technique. The use of euphemisms, right? Instead of just being explicit, the use of feet, the use of thighs, the use of other words to indicate it, but without being explicit. That was common. But it wasn't just in antiquity that they did this. When I was reading your book, I looked up Ezekiel 127, and I noticed that it clearly says in the Hebrew, his thighs, motnaiv, right? It clearly says in the Hebrew, his thighs, or whatever word we want to. But the NRSV translates this as the thighs.
Yeah.
So even modern translators today are trying to move away from this idea, as best they can, of God having physical, his thighs is a little bit removed from the thighs, right? And so I caught that we're still today uncomfortable with this concept, especially with this particular area of the body, of God having these particular physical attributes.
Exactly. And that very, as you say, that use of euphemism and wordplay to talk about the genitals, it's not because there was an inherent discomfort with the idea of God's having genitalia, because we find this also in other ancient Southwest Asian texts which do demonstrate a absolutely a cultural comfort with the idea that gods have bodies, that gods have genitals, that gods are sexually active. So this very elastic language is again part and parcel of a much broader cultural landscape. But it's interesting what we do, as translators, with trying to distance the deity from anything that we think is theologically inappropriate or uncomfortable. But we find it everywhere. I mean, look at what we do with, look at what's happened to Genesis 1, when it's the Spirit of God hovering over the waters, or is it the breath of God? Is the wind of God? Is he blowing on the waters as he does when the flood waters subside just a few chapters later? So, we're so used to this kind of our own cultural or theological preferences framing the way in which we then read ancient texts, and thereby often kind of distort their original context.
I think you make a very good case that the early depiction of the deity was anthropomorphic, that it would, that they visualized him as a human male, that as a person, right? But this clearly changed, right? And by the time we get down to Christianity, God, I think there's still some people that visualize him or speak about him as a male or in male pronouns and male terms. but the concept is more of a cosmic deity, a universal singular deity. When do you think that change took place within Judaism or Israelite religion?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of what we have in the Hebrew Bible is very comfortable with referring to God's body and God's body parts. And some of it is a little bit more, you can see it's getting a little bit more uncomfortable about it. So much so that we sometimes have, very rarely a couple of times, God says, I am not flesh. I am not a man. Doesn't mean to say he doesn't have a body or a human shaped body, but, trying to distance him a little bit from the messy nature of being human. But I think that right at the heart of this story is an idea that ancient worshippers, as reflected in the Hebrew Bible, they kind of knew that, what was extraordinary wasn't that God had a body, it was that he occasionally had allowed people to see it. So we're looking at a context in which, so Abraham had, walked along the road with him, and Jacob had his wrestling match. Moses went up Mount Sinai with the elders of Israel, and they saw, it says, they see his feet, and then they saw the God of Israel, and then they sit down and have dinner with him, which is a really nice detail in that text that I like. But it was understood that it was sensational that God had sometimes allowed people to see it. So people already knew that Yahweh, like other deities, preferred to hide his body. But I think it's when, that the early blow is struck in, the 6th to the 5th centuries BCE, when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed. And we can assume that, we're told that the vessels were removed, were looted from the temple and taken off, and we know that god napping was a very common strategy in terms of Assyrian imperial politics and Babylonian politics. So we can assume that whatever kinds of symbols, whether they were standing stones or an Ark of the Covenant or even a cult statue, gone. And that exposes, when you read texts like Deutero-Isaiah, so the name that we give to Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55, that seem to reflect this Babylonian exilic context for some of these thinkers, when you're starting to get these declarations that, Yahweh says, I am God, there is no other, or I am El, there is no other,
right.
I am the high God, there is no other. And you're also alongside some very hostile polemics against cult statues. What's the cult statue? The carpenter, he kind of like chops down a bit of tree, and then, and he turns half of it into a fire, and he cooks his dinner on half of it, and then with the other half he sculpts an image of a god and expects it to stand up. These texts are also taking the mickey out of, cult statues of Baal and, and Nabu and all these other Babylonian deities. And so this hostility, I think, reflects a very particular cultural moment theologically in the life of Yahweh, in which people recognize that cult statues are vulnerable to displacement, to disabling, to disfigurement. And for these people, in these thinkers that may or may not be represented by what we find in Deutero-Isaiah, but let's just say they are, for these people who are away from the Jerusalem temple, as far as they're aware, they are displaced, they are removed from God. And so they don't want a deity either who is somehow confined or restricted just to one particular territory, one particular place that they can no longer access. So all of a sudden, from this period onwards, the 6th century into the 5th century BC, Yahweh becomes a god with an even bigger universal reach. This is a deity that can reach into Babylon and manipulate the Babylonians to come in against his own people and punish them, because that's what he's decided. And so you get this hostility towards cult statues building. So when we read in the Ten Commandments, the ban on images, you look carefully at those verses, but in both the Exodus version and in Deuteronomy, and there's been some editorial activity in there. Yeah. You kind of get the idea that, do not worship other gods, do not bow down to them and worship them. And all of a sudden, do not make a cult image. You get a switch, from singular to plural and back. It looks a bit confused.
Right.
And so it looks like that's the point at which the ban on images starts to creep into what may have been slightly earlier versions of the Ten Commandments. This insertion that it's not just about do not worship other gods, because that's what's going to annoy Yahweh, and that's what's going to cause him to punish us, and that's what's going to lead you to be thrown out of the land. It's also do not make images. So we find that story in Deuteronomy that's linked to the Ten Commandments as they appear in Deuteronomy, when Moses says, when you saw, when you encountered Yahweh at Sinai, when Yahweh spoke to you, you didn't see anything, you only heard his voice. And that's why you can't make cult images, he says, because he's basically saying you don't even know what he looks like. So how can you make an image of him? So you're starting to get this increasing hostility towards cult statues, I think, in the Second Temple period. And most importantly, in the Second Temple period, what replaces the cult statue is Torah, is the Torah scroll. But that almost becomes almost a cult statue in its own right. That becomes the icon. It's that in front of, this is what's paraded around. This is what's held aloft in front of the people. This is, when people bow down and worship them. I mean, it's placed in the temple. It's now housed in this space. And so it's the written words of Yahweh that replaces the bodily presence of Yahweh from that period on. Increasingly so. I'm not saying it happened overnight. And I'm not saying it was universally understood to be that way. I mean, because, look at the example from Elephantine, where we have, in the 5th century BCE, we have a temple to Yahweh and what looked to be companion deities, even a consort of Yahweh in that temple. And there's some evidence to suggest that there were images in that temple too. So it wasn't all Yahweh worshippers were thinking this, but the version of Yahweh worship that's represented by the Hebrew Bible, that's when it starts to become increasingly an iconic, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I tend to agree with you because I have always had a problem with the notion that the same religion that bans graven images, this is images that that are carved out of wood and overlaid with gold, its central figure was a wooden box carved out of wood, overlaid with gold, with two hybrid mythological beings on the cover, right? The Ark of the Covenant, right, is what? Now, it's not an idol, correct, right? They're very clear to make sure in the description that it's not an idol, but it's a wooden box, made and manufactured out of wood, overlaid in gold with these two hybrid mythological figures on top of it that represents the presence of the deity.
Yeah.
But it's not an idol. Don't call it an idol, right? But we're still going to take it everywhere we go, and we're still going to put it in the Holy of Holies in the temple, but it's not an idol. But all of the other graven images made out of wood, overlaid in gold, those are banned. So that was always a clear problem, which is why I have always assumed, or at least thought maybe, that the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant wasn't necessarily at the hands of some foreign government, that maybe during Hezekiah's reform it just, there was the Ark of the Covenant was there, but even later on, this thing is a problem.
Yeah, and that's what's so, I mean, it's so interesting. The Ark of the Covenant is so closely, this is the object, the sacred object on which, or, upon which the deity is said to be enthroned or to stand, or, is somehow present. And yet, this is an object that is so closely identified with the deity that, we have verses where, Moses quotes what seems to be a really ancient kind of ritual refrain where it says, where the ark would move and Yahweh moved. And, it's so closely identified with the deity that it is the deity. So in the same way that a cult statue isn't just a representation, but a manifestation of deity, so too the Ark of the Covenant functions in the same way. And it does look to me, I personally think, what's the best explanation for this kind of object? And it looks to me exactly like those little box shrines that you see cult statues of deities carried around in. There's a photograph in my book just that includes an example of one of these little box shrines that like a little sanctuary for the deity to dwell in. And I think that's what the Ark of the Covenant those traditions seem to be reflecting. So I think we can imagine that there was a statue of Yahweh hanging around that.
Especially for a nomadic people that didn't have a land and didn't have a temple. Once they had a land, what happens? They build a temple, and they put the Ark of the Covenant in the temple, and the temple then appropriates all of the veneration that was once reserved for the Ark, right? The temple becomes the thing that's venerated, and the Ark essentially disappears, right? We don't have a text that says the Ark was carried off. It just disappears from the memory. And I can't help but think that was very convenient, at least, because of this iconism, right? This icon, they didn't want these icons because of this later shift away from this physical nature of the representation, the physical nature of the deity. So I see it going back to the Ark of the Covenant. It became a problem. Once they got away from an anthropomorphic deity, the Ark of the Covenant's a problem, right? And so
it's redundant.
It just disappears. There's no story which leads to all these, what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. But maybe they just made it go away. Hezekiah brags about all these other things that were created by the Israelites, right? As things that were worshipped, used to worship the Hebrew God. It's not like
they were perfectly normative things as well.
Correct.
So all the things that we later dismiss as somehow deviant or polytheistic, this was good old-fashioned, bog-standard, traditional, ancient Israelite religion. But the Ark of the Covenant is interesting, isn't it? Because, we talk about the way in which the Torah replaces, becomes the physical icon almost. Not just to be read, it's to be looked at, it's to be gazed upon. We talk about the way that replaces a cult statue in a temple. And interestingly, there's those few verses on, the Deuteronomist said, there was nothing in the Ark of the Covenant, just the tablets of stone and the Torah. That's all that was in the Ark of the Covenant. So even then, it's almost kind of like it's already being snuck into this sanctuary.
That's right. That even the Ark was merely a receptacle for the written text. Once it becomes a religion of the book, the Ark was just for the written text. I mean, they wanted to get rid of these icons completely because they had such a problem with what you wrote an entire book about. So let me ask you this as we conclude. How do you feel your book is being received? Are you getting feedback from people saying, that's even though that's what the text clearly says, how is the book being received?
Generally, I've been amazed, even from some quite conservative reviewers, some of whom have said, I don't agree with you in principle, which I always find weird. What does that mean in principle? What, you just decide that you don't agree with me? I don't agree with you in principle, but this is an amazing book and I really enjoyed it. And so the comeback has been, she doesn't understand religious faith. That's what the comeback has been. That's what the main criticisms have been. She doesn't understand what it is to have a personal relationship with God. I make it very clear in the book that I'm an atheist. I always have been. But I get the usual, there are some very, from certain religious quarters, there are people that are always very cross with me for some reason or another. Sometimes it's because of what I say or write, but sometimes it's just because I'm a woman, just because I teach the Bible. But on the whole, the response has been good. And I think what's really delighted me the most are those people who said, I always thought the Bible was really boring. I always thought that, it was, it wasn't worth bothering about. I had no idea that it was so interesting, that it was so cool, that it's so fun, that these ancient cultures were so, fascinating. And that, for me, is that's the big that's when I get really, really happy, because I think that's why I wrote it. That's why I studied this stuff in the first place, because I thought it was fascinating. And so, the Bible isn't just for religious people. The Bible belongs to all of us.
That's right.
And if it means that people that wouldn't ordinarily even be bothered to pick up a Bible and look at what it says, it means that if my book is giving people a reason to turn to these ancient texts and to think about them in their original context, then that's my job done. I'm happy.
Well, that's one of the things I love about you. Not only are you an excellent scholar and you talk to other scholars and research and write books, but you take the time to educate the public, and that you want to go out and make sure that the public understands what a wonderful book the Bible is, what a fascinating religion Judaism is. And just, I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't gotten it yet, go out and get God and Anatomy. Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. I really appreciate your being here today.
Oh, thank you. Honestly, I've had the best time talking to you. It's so much fun. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you again, and I wish you everything the best.
Thank you.
And for all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Dr. Bob Cargill, wishing you everything the best.